All right. Welcome one and all to our living room lecture series, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, we have a presentation on recent investigations of the ancestral Maya groundstone tool industry in the Mountain Pine Ridge Forest Reserve, Belize by Dr. John Spenard. My name is Adam Easley, and I am the Public Archaeology Coordinator at the San Diego Archaeological Center. Save the date for our next exciting in-person lecture, The Skeletons of La Constantita, with bioarchaeologist Professor Jose Aguilar, on Saturday, December 16th. More details coming soon. This Saturday, October 14th, in the Center Classroom, is our second Saturday lecture screening, where we share some of our favorite past living lecture presentations. This month's screening are A Day in the Life of a Physician in Ancient Egypt and The First Chicken Burrito in Western North America. Join us October 21st for the San Diego Archaeological Society's Ark in the Park, a free community event and day of archaeology for all ages. The event is celebrating California Archaeology Month and is being held at the Los Penasquitos Adobe Ranch House from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. More details are available at sdcas.org. Mark your calendars for November 4th. It's Archaeology Day, a family-friendly event presented by the Colorado Desert Archaeological Society. They'll have basket weaving, storytelling, pottery making, guided hikes, and more. So come join us from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. at the Ancestral Desert State Park Visitor Center. More information and hike registration can be found at www.anzabragoarcheo.org. Details on these events and other information about the center, our curation efforts, and programs can be found online at sandiegoarchaeology.org. Tonight, we will be using the Q&A feature. You can find it on your Zoom control panel. Feel free to submit questions at any time, and they'll be answered at the end of the presentation during the moderated Q&A. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. John Spenard. Dr. Spenard is an associate professor of anthropology at Cal State San Marcos. He joined the department in 2016 after receiving his PhD from UC Riverside in 2014 and his MA from Florida State University in 2007. Dr. Spenard has been conducting research on ancestral Maya society for over 25 years, with a focus on ritual landscape, particularly the ceremonial cave use in Belize, Guatemala, and Mexico. After joining CSUSM, he started the Frio Regional Archaeological Project in 2018 to study the Maya presence in the Mountain Pine Ridge Forest Reserve in central western Belize, starting with the Frio Caves. Over the course of the next 2 field seasons, the project unexpectedly grew in scope to include settlement survey and now a granitic rock extraction and groundstone implement crafting industry. It is now my honor to introduce to you Dr. John Spenard.
All right, thank you, Adam, for that welcome introduction, and thank you all for those of you who are coming out tonight to see this. To my students, to my folks, friends in Belize, international folks, thank you all for coming out. I appreciate you taking the time to hear what we're up to. So I will share my screen 1 second here and get started. Oops. All right. Adam or Dante, is this you? Are you seeing my screen? Just want to make sure we're good before I go.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, thanks. All right, so tonight I'm going to talk to you. The title of my talk is "It's Grind Time: Recent Investigations of the Ancestral Maya Groundstone Tool Industry in the Mountain Pine Ridge Forest Reserve, Belize." And this is a project that, if it wasn't obvious by my introduction, from Adam, this was a really unexpected turn that my project had taken. But what I want to do tonight is I'll talk about that, but what I want to do is sort of contextualize this research in terms of what how it came about and the importance of these sites. But to begin, we'll first ground ourselves geographically. So here's a map of Central America, and here is Belize on the Caribbean coast, right here. Adjacent to Mexico and Guatemala. The area that I'm working in is the Mountain Pine Ridge Forest Reserve. It's in central western Belize, and it's most of the research area that we're working in is a managed forest reserve that's managed by the Belize Forest Department and the Belizean government. Okay. And I want to make that clear because I will be talking about the reserve, and I'll also be talking about its namesake, the mountain pine ridge, throughout this talk. And so I want to distinguish between the reserve and the mountain pine ridge itself. Okay. Zooming in a bit more on that area, this differently colored area here is largely the Mountain Pine Ridge Forest Reserve. And it's made up, it has actually a really distinct geography and geology. Most of the Maya lowlands is made up of limestone bedrock, but where the Mountain Pine Ridge gets its name is that in this area here outlined in red is a series of granitic upwellings, ancient upwellings that drain central Belize, and there's actually the headwaters of most of the rivers. Surrounding that on the northeast and southwest and south is the Santa Rosa group. I'm not going to be talking about that much tonight, but I'm going to focus on the limestone bedrock area and then the Mountain Pine Ridge batholith itself. These two areas, these two geologic regions actually have very different environments. And these are actually both important for understanding the archaeological sites that are here. The limestone bedrock is where we find the typical broadleaf forest. In this area, it's because it's a forest reserve, it's incredibly thick broadleaf forest back here. It's not being used, it's not being logged, etc. And that contrasts very greatly with the vegetation on the Mountain Pine Ridge itself, on the granite. That granite soil is not very suitable for broadleaf forest to grow, and instead we get this open savanna scrub-like vegetation with pine trees. Right? So we get these really contrasting ecosystems here, and actually they transition pretty quickly in many places. Okay? So with that environmental overview out of the way, I want to talk now also about the history of research that's been done here to, again, contextualize the work that I'm doing and its place in the archaeological record. Right? So the very first archaeological study of this done in this region was conducted by Gregory Mason, and it was unexpected work. He was commissioned by the High Foundation Museum of the American Indian in New York to travel to Belize in Mexico to collect ethnographic objects. And when he reached San Ignacio, Belize, during that trip, he heard about some caves that were down in this, it turned out to be this area. And he went and explored them and found that they were untouched, and he conducted some excavations in there over the course of it seems about a couple of weeks. And he identified 3 caves, naming them A, B, and C. Today, these are really easily accessible tourist destinations that the roads drive right up to them. But no work has been done on them since his initial study of them. Here he is in front of Cave C, and just for contrast, standing there almost 90 years later is me and one of my first crew of students who came down with me in 2019. You notice the cleft rock behind Mason there, and here's the cleft rock up above us right here. 10 years later, Sir J. Eric S. Thompson went to the Mountain Pine Ridge to conduct a survey for what he was looking for: pre-agricultural deposits, pre-Maya settlement. He didn't find anything up there, but he did find a few cairns, piles of stacked rocks, with a few artifacts around, but nothing that was datable. So it was really unsuccessful. And it turns out that later those might have been historic. Some of those might have been historic markers laid down as a territorial boundary. In 1959, Archaeological Commissioner Hamilton Anderson caught word of ongoing looting of a couple of caves down in the Rio Frio area, and he had went down there to try and to catch them and put a stop to it. He didn't find the people. He didn't catch them. However, he did document 2 new caves D and E. And because of the threat of looting, the day that he found them, he actually conducted some salvage excavations. And he writes about having to do this by hand because he wasn't prepared for excavations. He returned sometime later, accompanied sometime with some of those trips by David Pendergast, and they conducted some more salvage operations there. But again, those caves have not been studied since. In 1961, archaeologist William Billiard, who was working in the Belize Valley at the time, reported in American Antiquity what he called a unique Maya shrine site on the mountain pine ridge of British Honduras. Very short description. What you see here on the screen is half of the article that he wrote about it. Just a very short description. He didn't conduct any excavations, but he noted there's a couple of artifacts around. He just assumed that it was Maya, and just a short description of the site, and that was it. He never had gone back and done any work there. And that was it. And that's been the history of research done in the Pine Ridge until the until the more recent 2000s. Holly Moyes and Jaime Awe recorded a few caves in this area for their regional caves project over the course of 2014 and 2016. Now, partially due to a lack of research, but also partially due to the fact that not much had ever been found there with these projects, the perceptions of the archaeological potential of this region were really we see that there's not it's not highly regarded as a region with archaeological potential. In 1959, the British government commissioned a land survey report of of Belize and included the Pine Ridge area. And of the Pine Ridge, Wright and his colleagues wrote, "It seems clear that neither the ancient Maya nor the modern Maya have ever practiced agriculture on the poor soils of the mountain Pine Ridge. Indeed, the evidence of ancient Maya activities is so far restricted to one small granite religious structure, probably the one that Bullier wrote about a few years later, and interestingly, rectangular pits in the rock that might possibly be areas where slabs of stone for corn grinding troughs, metates, were quarried." Now, interestingly, in my research, in my background research, this second half of what Wright talked about has never caught on, and I haven't seen it cited anywhere else. So, if anybody experienced archaeologists out there who's from Belize has seen this anywhere, please let me know. But this is one of the first mentions that we see of these quarries, and the only mention that we see of these quarries. Writing in 2005, David Lentz, who's an ethnobotanist, writes, "The acidic soils in the mountain Pine Ridge, highly weathered and derived largely from granite bedrock, are unsuitable for agriculture, accounting for the low density of pre-Columbian and modern habitation." And the few studies that do include this area continually mention the lack of settlement up here. And indeed, when we look at a map of sites in Belize, we do see that this appears to be a vacant region. There's no sites on the Pine Ridge itself. Yet this lack of settlement and lack of sites contrasts with knowledge that the mountain Pine Ridge was an incredibly important source of a variety of resources, many that were used by the Maya, many unique to this particular region. Now, of interest for us tonight is that granite. What we see, thanks to several sourcing studies, both with portable flux X-ray fluorescence, as well as petrographic analysis, what we have found over the years is that there's 3 granite sources in Belize, but the mountain Pine Ridge is the favored granite for making granite tools. And that's not to say that granite's always used for things like monos and metates, but when it was, the mountain Pine Ridge granite is by far the preferred source for it. So you see on this map here, which is adapted from my colleague Tani Tibbet's dissertation, these orange pie charts here, the orange in the pie charts represents mountain Pine Ridge granite. And we see up in northwestern Belize and northeastern Belize, almost 90% of granite tools are sourced to the mountain Pine Ridge. As we get closer to the source, the percentages are equal to that. It's also been found, PXRF has been done at the site of Ucanal, and it's been determined that in Guatemala, and the granite there is also sourced to the mountain Pine Ridge. Liz Graham and geologist Shipley have, in the 70s, had done a petrographic analysis of granite tools from the sites of Huachactún in Guatemala and found that it's mountain Pine Ridge granite. Those sourcing studies haven't been done yet up here in Mexico at the site of Calakmul, they report granite tools also in this area. And recently I've come across reports that show the middle preclassic period sites in the Mirador region often too were using granite tools and granite. Presumably, we need the sourcing studies done, but presumably that's also mountain pine ridge granite. And so this source is incredibly important for the eastern lowlands and the central lowlands of the Maya throughout, dating it back at least to probably the middle preclassic period through the end of the late classic period. So we're looking at over 1,000 years of use. Yet, as recently as 2021, archaeologists studying granite tools have noted very little archaeological evidence exists in Belize to furnish understandings of where and how raw groundstone materials such as granite was quarried by the ancient Maya. So we know that the Maya Mountains and Mountain Pine Ridge was an incredibly important source of resources, yet little archaeological work has been done up there. And so this is where my project comes in. The Rio Frio Regional Archaeological Project, also known as RIFRAP, which I started in 2018. Now, because most of the sites known up in the Mountain Pine Ridge were caves, and given my history with cave archaeology, that's where the project began, is studying the caves. So some of the primary research questions foundational research questions that we asked is when and why were the Rio Frio caves being used? Who were the people using the caves? Were they long-distance pilgrims? The lack of settlements elsewhere in the region suggests that that might have been the case, or perhaps there was a local population. However, given the economic importance of the Pine Ridge too, we also wanted to know what the extent of the ancient Maya presence is on the Mountain Pine Ridge in the reserve. Bulliard Shrine is up in that area. Thompson found some of those cairns. So what is the Maya presence up there? And especially what we wanted to know is where are those economically important resources, granite in particular, but slate, other metamorphic rock, pine, where are they being harvested from and by who? And also, what is Bulliard Shrine? And are there other ritual structures up there that are like it? Now, I mentioned before that Mason's caves A, B, and C are very easily accessible, and that's where we started our project. But in 2019, we set out to relocate the caves D and E that Hamilton Anderson had investigated. And this is where our project took our first turn in an unexpected direction, because we never found the cave. And in fact, we still have not relocated the cave. Even as recently as this summer, I went out to try and relocate it and it was not successful. But what we found instead was this. This here is my foreman, Javi Mai, from San Antonio Village in Belize, standing on top of a 30-foot tall pyramid. And as Javi is climbing up this pyramid, my co-director, Mike, was off in the bush, and he's yelling back at us, saying, "We found something." After Javi and I recollected ourselves from this, we went and tracked Mike down, and he was standing in front of this, which is a phyllite stela. What we had stumbled into was the site that we named Nohochbatzo. This was an unrecorded site that the second site documented in the Mountain Pine Ridge Forest Reserve. The other one was found by Holly Moyes and Jaime Awe. That one has never been surveyed or excavated. So this was the second settlement in the Mountain Pine Ridge Forest Reserve, and it's the first to be studied. Okay. Zooming in a little bit, it's a site that consists of 3 or 4 plazas. We're still not sure if this is a plaza here or not. This is the pyramidal structure that Javi was standing on. This was the stela that Mike was standing in front of, that Mike and Javi were standing in front of from a few images ago. And so this was 2019, and COVID shut us down, of course. And so we had to wait for a few years to return there. However, and I'll come back to that in a minute. In the beginning of this year, we actually got a LiDAR survey done of a portion of our permit area, of our research area. And LiDAR is essentially a technology where that shoots lasers down from airplanes that lets you see the surface, the ground surface. You can digitally deforest everything and see what's lying underneath. And it turns out that the LiDAR survey did in fact showed that no Hochbotzo is actually there, and our map of it was fairly complete. And there likely is not a plaza here. This is that structure that was on the earlier map right here. However, there was a surprise. When we got the LiDAR back, turns out that up in the northwest part of the valley, there was another plaza that we had not encountered before. And I'll come back and talk about this at the end of this talk, but this is going to play an important part of our research moving forward. This is just an isometric view from the LiDAR data of no Hochbotzo. Here's that structure to the southwest. This is the pyramid. This is the Stela Plaza here, and this is the new plaza up here. Now, what really struck us, though, when we saw this, was that no Hochbotzo is aligned roughly east-west. It's a slight orientation off of due east-west, but this is the main part of the site, the main axis of the site. Plaza 5 is aligned much differently, which suggests to us that it was very different. It's almost 10 degrees further off of east-west than the main site core. Yeah. But I'll come back to that. What I want to talk to you now is about how we found the Buffalo Hill Quarries. And as I said, COVID shut us down in 2019, and we weren't able to return until 2022. And 2022 got off to a really rough start. This is what our 2022 season looked like. COVID, road construction. And unfortunately, road construction led to further logistical difficulties because they were improving the road by importing clay and raising the road up with clay. And it started to rain. And you can see the further logistical difficulties here. Our van got stuck in the mud. Well, not wanting to waste the opportunity that particular day, which turned out to be a fateful day, we decided to hop out. We weren't going to make it up this hill. We hopped out and started conducting survey. And what we found originally when we hopped out was chert flakes and quartzite flakes. And now we had found a few of these around before, as we conducted opportunistic pedestrian survey. So we have about a 2-hour commute. It's a long drive, so anytime we have to stop, we hop out and look around wherever we stop to see if there's anything around. And we've documented probably about a few dozen of these low density lithic scatters around. However, on this particular day, this low density lithic scatter was actually pretty, had quite a lot of material in it. And so my co-director, Mike, who loves to piece plot everything, hopped out and started piece plotting all of these flakes and the few dozen flakes that were there. As the rest of the team was sort of milling around and helping out and surveying, my foreman, Javi Mai, remembered knowing about a few sites nearby, and here he is telling them about them to our my member Franklin Quiros. He says, there's a few mounds over here, and so Javi went off and he came back a little while later. And he said, I've counted 7 of them. And so we went over and went to look at what it was, what he was pointing us to. And this is the first of those mounds that he brought us to. And it was immediately clear to me what the significance of what we were seeing. Based on all those sourcing surveys, this was clearly a granite quarry. And everything you see here is chipped granite flakes. This is debitage. This is production waste from making those manos and metates. Right? Making those granite objects. Now we had other research goals for that season, so we only spent about a week out here. But over the course of the 2022 season, we mapped this. This is what we mapped, and the results of that are about 16 hectares surveyed. In that 16 hectares, we identified about 15 quarry/workshop areas. Where we were finding a variety of preforms of granite tools. But we also identified 2 different types of extraction features. cut faces. So this was exposed bedrock faces that we could see that were cut into to extract blocks. But we also identified several quarry pits. And within these polygons, hopefully you can see there's hatch markings in here. And this is the extent of granite debitage associated with some of these features. These pink polygons are the quarry pits themselves. So that season, well, this is what it looked like when we were conducting surveys. So it was still very heavily vegetated. And so we were limited to what we could see. So we just mapped what we could see. But even still, it was productive. We identified nearly 10 metate preforms or nearly complete discards. One that looks like it was in the very final stages of production that was maybe dropped as it was being carried out. And some of them in very, very early stages. You can just see the basin formed right here. Hammerstones cached all around the debitage piles, primarily made of quartzite, roughly about the size of a softball or baseball. But there's a few large ones, like these two here. This one on the right we had considered that one a two-handed hammerstone. It's too big to hold with one hand. However, turns out that there are bigger ones. When we were back there this summer, this is the largest one so far. You can see it's bigger than my head, and this thing probably weighed about 70 pounds. I pulled it from my feet here, put it right back down because it was so heavy. So we got some from baseball-sized hammerstones to hammerstones, head-sized hammerstones. We also documented what we're calling at the time mono preforms, and we identified two different types of mono preforms. Half lobes, which were by far the more common ones, which you see here. Many of them had pointed edges on them too. And we also identified full lobes in various stages of reduction. Now, we originally called these preforms, and why I have this in quotes here is that if we look at some ethnographic literature from Guatemala, ethnoarchaeologist Brian Hayden encountered a Guatemalan stoneworker who remembered how to make stone tools, how to make manos and metates using stone tools. And he provided, they worked together for a while and demonstrated how to do it. And Hayden recorded this whole process. And what we can see here are these two-handed and single-handed picks that have pointed edges on them that are being used to shape the blocks, to shape the metate blocks. And so it's possible that some of what we're seeing here, they're not so much preforms, mono preforms, as maybe they're some kind of production tools similar to what we see here in Highland, Guatemala today. Some other features that we came across were bedrock milling features. I've been working with California archaeologists, and so we have California archaeology. We have lithic scatters and bedrock milling features, but we actually have them here, and we identified about 6 that season. And then we recorded this block. This was unique to the 2022 season. Suggested that perhaps it was a shrine of some kind. It was purposely put here. This is all fill, local fill that was brought in. And so this block was purposefully erected in this position. It's not a natural block. It's not a bedrock exposure. It's just a big block that was placed this way. And you can't see it well in this picture, but it's got a pointed corner at the top here, almost like a house in profile. So possibly something like an anvil, perhaps. All right, so going into our 2023 season, we had a really good idea of what to expect in terms of tools that we would find at the quarry sites, but we had a whole variety of questions coming out of that 2022 season. One is, how large is the Buffalo Hills Quarry site? Turns out that we knew that there was we didn't have enough time to map everything that was there. So how large is it? What is the source of the quartzite to make the hammerstones? Quartzite is known to be from the Santa Rosa Formation, so perhaps they're bringing it from the other side of the Mountain Pine Ridge, but trying to figure out where those are from. What's the function of the bedrock mortars? What does a fully exposed quarry workshop area look like? And could we identify workstations? And what we also wanted to know too is a foundational question is, how is this raw material actually being extracted? Are there different methods between cut faces and quarry pits? Now, just a reminder, this is what most of what we were working in looked like, right? And so addressing some of these questions, to understand some of these questions, we had to clear this area, and we got permission from forestry in 2013 or 2023 season to be able to clear one of these quarry pits and get a better idea of what it looks like. But I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The first question we addressed is, how large is the Buffalo Hills quarry site? And thanks to that LiDAR survey, we were actually able to address some of that, to address that question. So the what you see here, those polygons are what we had mapped in 2022. The green triangles were things that looked like quarry pits in the LiDAR data based on what we had seen here. And so the site almost doubled in size, almost tripled in size from when we had mapped the season before. And so we had actually, the beginning part of 2023 season, we went out and ground truthed these, and we confirmed that all but 2 are in fact quarry pits. The 2 that you see here are in fact quarry pits. This is the map that we finished in the 2023 season. And we wound up mapping a total of about 40 hectares. Now, to give you a sense of scale, this is about, at its widest here, it's about 1 kilometer long, and at its widest north-south direction is about 0.5 kilometer wide. 40 hectares is roughly about 75 to 80 American football fields. But for those of you who are local here, here's Cal State San Marcos campus. And here is, if we enclose all the buildings and draw and measure around all the buildings on campus, we're at 36.5 hectares. So the Buffalo Hills Quarry site is about the size of all the buildings combined on my college campus, my university campus. So how large is the Buffalo Hills Quarry site? It's big. It's the size of a college campus, and it's about 40 hectares or so. What is the source? Next question we addressed is, what is the source of the quartzite to make the hammerstones? Well, conducting reconnaissance, you'll notice this feature up here that I had circled earlier. When conducting reconnaissance and ground truthing those potential sites, we actually found a quartzite vein running in the northwestern corner of that site. And what you see here, the ground is covered in quartzite flakes from that vein. And this is actually a mound here. We haven't begun to excavate this, but I'm assuming that this is a quartzite hammerstone workshop. And so within the Buffalo Hills Quarry site, we have several granite quarries, but we also have a quartzite quarry and hammerstone workshop as well. So they were harvesting all the rocks that they needed right here to make the tools. The next question we wanted to address is, what was the function of the bedrock mortars? And to address that question, as we were conducting reconnaissance, we made our way up here and found that this was an ideal place to test that question. So zooming in here, what you see is what we called feature 22. All these small lines here are cut faces. And the dots here represent different types of the tools that you just saw before that we recorded on the surface there. So this was a good place to test what cut face extraction looked like, or strip mining really is what we saw here. This is a couple different shots of the same 3D model of a cut face or a quarry pit or strip mine here. And you can see the bedding planes right here, the cut rock right there, and right here. And there's those right there. Just to get an idea, and this is what those cut faces look like. Okay. And wherever we could see on the hill, moving all the way down, we identified these cut faces. But within many of the more open areas, we actually found probably close to a dozen, if not more, bedrock mortars. And these things were everywhere up along these cut faces. And you can see one of those cut faces right here. And we also noticed that we found several of them had sediment, had filled them in. We were able to clear that away, and they became much more obvious. So there's those features there. Now, what we had hypothesized, again, based on Brian Hayden's earlier work in Highland Guatemala with modern day mano metate makers, is that these milling features may actually be preform finishing or shaping stations, or mono finishing stations. So Hayden published this picture of his colleague Ramon shaping a mono here. And he doesn't write about this in the report. However, if you notice underneath, as he's pecking and turning the mono, it creates a little nest in the ground down below. Now, many of these milling features that we found in this area are actually in places kind of right on the edge of slopes. They're perfect places to sit. And here I am. I just grabbed a couple pieces of debitage to demonstrate what this actually might have looked like. Okay? These are perfect. These are perfect seats, and these are pretty much always on slopes that you can sit and work between your legs, much like Ramon's doing here in his workshop. Now, moving on, you can see a couple of those mortars right here. We actually did encounter one that was on a pretty steep slope, and that was just barely peeking through. And so we decided to conduct an excavation here to see if we could identify this as how these were being used. And we had assumed, or we had hypothesized that we're going to find a lot of sand. Fortunately, this whole hill is covered in sand, and so whether or not it's how it was produced, whether it's through pecking or natural erosion, it's impossible to say. However, what we found, there's that mortar, and there it is right here exposed. What we found upon excavation is that we had very quickly run into a cut face. That this, you can see the damage here. They had cut this away, and we're quarrying this. It was basically strip mining on the side of a hill. Most of what we found, though, wasn't sand, although but what we found instead were these big blocks. And this circle here is just to point out the same rock exposed in the wall. It's nothing unique, but just to provide you an anchor, to a visual anchor. We had a lot of these big blocks in here, and these were actually in situ. But when we look at the debitage right here, what we exposed is that they're large plates of sheets of granite, right? There's not a lot of debitage, there's just these large sheets that had been exposed. And so we didn't realize at the time, but what we were seeing here is evidence of how these things are being extracted. To get at how we came to understand how those things were being extracted, we have to move to another part of the site. So we were up here in the northeast part of the Buffalo Hills Quarry. We're going to move down here to the southwest part of it, down here, to a feature that we called feature 25. And these show up really well in the LiDAR data. You can see they look like these donuts. Within feature 25, we identified two different quarry pits. We had quarry pit 1, quarry pit 2, but you can see there's another one right here, a smaller one here, another one here, and there's another one just off the screen here. So these are very easily visible in the LiDAR. Now, when we started here at this quarry site, I showed you this picture before. This is what the quarry looked like, the quarry pit looked like when we first started working there. Because it looked like some of the other quarry sites, we decided to clear this one and do a total survey of it to map everything that we could find there. So we completely cleared it of vegetation, and you can see quarry pit 1 right here and quarry pit 2 right here. I'll flip back here really quick. This tree right here is this tree right here. Okay. This is a panoramic shot, so it distorts what it looks like, but you get the ring, the quarry pit 1 ring right here, and the quarry pit 2 ring right here. Thanks to a very dedicated team, we started piece plotting the non-debitage surface artifacts. And I figured we'd be here for a couple of days. This process wound up taking the entire field season to accomplish. There was so much here, so much more than we had anticipated. And just to show you the results of that, Each of these dots represents one of those non-debitage artifacts that we recovered. We photographed each one, we took field measurements of them, and it's all recorded in our GIS. The results of that, 103 hammerstones, mostly quartzite, a few chert ones, 145 mono preforms. Again, I put this in quotes because it includes some picks. And early on, we weren't distinguishing the two, but as we moved along, we started to be able to better identify and differentiate between mono preforms that were rounded as well as, and then versus picks that had some points on them. So mono preforms in quotes, half lobes and lobes, we have over 200 of those, 13 metate preforms, and then 2 wedges or pry bars. And I'll come back to talk about those in a few minutes. Okay, so a lot more in this one quarry, this double quarry pit feature than we had found the previous season. We also conducted excavations, and because we wanted to know more about the debitage piles, if these are berms that were dug down or if these are debitage piles themselves, how deep are the deposits here, and what makes up the deposits. Now, the reason we chose to excavate where we did is that if we go back here, you can see that there's quite a bit of non-debitage artifacts here. For the most part, the quarry pits, the bases of the quarry pits are fairly empty of anything. But there was a concentration of debitage here, which turned out to be mostly preforms. And so we put an excavation there. There's also, you can't see it very well here, but there was another one of those anvil stones, potential anvil stones right here. And so trying to figure out what those things are used for. And then because that concentration of objects there, we put an excavation in. Here's a heat map of the distribution of those objects, and you can see the concentration of material of non-debitage materials right here in the center of the quarry pit. But where things were most concentrated, and this was from an excavation unit, was here on the southeast corner of the site. Now, this is really unique, and everybody I've shown this to has different opinions about what this is. But digging down, we came across this. So we get debitage like we had seen everywhere else, but then on the bottom of the debitage was a pretty thick layer of sand that was mixed with quartzite and chert flakes. And that sand, as we clean that sand off, turns out that sand was also down in between the cracks of these blocks down here, and those chert and quartzite flakes were also mixed into that sand. Now, we don't know what to make of this. It looks as if a big sheet of granite had been pushed over. The breaks are natural. They kern patterns. This is not, the Maya didn't shape this. However, this could be natural weathering. Like I said, everybody, geologists I've spoken to, everybody I've spoken to about this, everybody has different opinions of it. But these are blocks, and these are sitting on top of bedrock right here also. And we can lift each of these up. But we left this where it is. But I think this is probably a working platform here. And that's why we have such a high concentration of artifacts here through that excavation, through that work, is because this is probably a working platform outside of the quarry pit. All right, so going back to our excavation in the center of the unit, the center of the quarry pit, we put a 9-meter long trench starting from the center, that concentration of objects out to beyond the rim of it. This is that triangular block here from the center of the quarry pit that was purposely erected there. I think these are probably some kind of related to production. They're production anvils of some kind. I'm not sure what they are though, or how they're being used just yet. Now, like we found in feature 22, most of what we excavated was not production debitage, but these large plates of granite, these large thin sheets of granite blocks. And here I've just piled up a few of them to give a sense of what these things looked like. They're too thin to be used as monos, to be turned into monos. They're too thin, definitely too thin to be used as metates. So what this was really eluded us until we got more of the quarry pit uncovered. And here you're looking at a 3D model, an overhead shot of the 3D model of the center of the quarry pit. There's that anvil right there. Here's the remnants of all that worked material right there. But what you're looking at here is the exposed bedrock, and the quarry pit, the slope of the quarry pit pretty much ends right here. And so we excavated down into the hillside, and this is what we encountered. What it looks like they're doing is somehow removing material, exposing material and breaking it off. Right? How they did it, though, really came into focus in this corner here. Notice that circular pool of water there. It was raining quite a bit, and because of this, all the sand, this thing just flooded every day, so we had to bail it out. But that corner gives us a microcosm of all the things that were happening here. So you get a quartzite hammerstone, a full loaf mono preform, a bedrock milling feature, and then this brick. Looking closer at this brick, turns out that the front end, or part of it, had been beveled off. And this actually is what we came to realize, is that this was an extraction tool. These are pry bars. So I talked about these wedges before. We only identified 2 of them, but there's probably more out there. We didn't recognize these until later on towards the end of the field season. And so when we continue our work there, we're probably going to find more of these. But how these are used, I'm hypothesizing right now, is that these were pry bars. And what they were doing was using these and shoving them under the natural bedding planes within the granite, the natural erosion planes in the granite, and prying it off, and essentially trying to get workable material that they could make monos and metates out of. And so here is my demonstration of how those might have been used. Right? The result, though, would have been this debitage that was pried off of here. Right? So this is how we explain these large pieces of granite. They're just trying to extract the smaller material that they then can get to the more workable material. All right. So the results then of our season, if we compare the 2 seasons, this leads us into the sort of questions for future research. If we compare the results of our pedestrian survey from 2022 for a full coverage survey of feature 25 in 2023, we see that there's a lot more out here. This is a huge site, and there's a lot of production happening here. So in 2022, we surveyed 15 hectares. We recorded 69 hammerstones, 53 mono preforms, including picks, and 10 metate preforms. Feature 25 measures 0.14 hectares in size, 103 hammerstones, 140, over 200 mono preforms, 13 metates, and at least 2 wedges or pry bars. So this is an incredibly rich site, and we're really looking at large scale production here, which is expected given where all these tools are making their way to. But let's just, if we can, just extrapolate here. This was our 2022 season. Right? Those numbers I just gave you came from this whole particular area right here. This is feature 25 right here. So if we can add those numbers to these sizes, we get a sense of how much was actually being produced here. And these are the materials that were discarded. These are not the materials that were exported out. So beginning to wrap up here then, right? Some questions for future research. So we have a really good idea now of what was being produced here. We have a really good idea of how this material is being extracted, although we still have more questions about how it's being extracted, right? Are they using pry bars everywhere? How are the cut faces? How is this material extracted from cut faces, etc. However, some questions for future research that we can begin to answer now too with the data that we have. Important question to know is, when were these being used? I mentioned earlier in the talk that there's granite objects recorded in sites that date to Middle Preclassic in northern Guatemala. Most granite tools that were sourced are from late Classic period sites. So we're looking at a period of 1,500 years roughly or so that this material is being used for. So when do these quarries date to, and can we figure out which quarries were being supporting people at during which time periods? And it turns out that we can begin to answer this question because we recovered quite a bit of ceramic material. Unfortunately, because of the acidic soils in this region, they're incredibly eroded. But here is actually on this bedrock exposure here, we found a partially intact jar right here. Okay. And then we also found several ceramics, and primarily through all along the rim of the quarry pits. Some of them are ash, volcanic ash tempered and have some red slip on them. That's a diagnostic marker, diagnostic ceramic type for Belize that dates primarily to the late Classic period. I don't have a picture of it here. However, a lot of the ceramics that we also recovered had thick layers of charcoal in them. And in fact, a lot of them had just big piles of charcoal inside the broken and shattered vessels. And so we have a lot of charcoal. We have over 600 grams of charcoal that we're going to, at some point, we're going to get radiocarbon dates on. So we have some preliminary dating data that this is late Classic period, but we have a lot more time that we need to account for. A real pressing question, though, is that the Buffalo Hill Quarry site is large. That's undeniable, right? However, if we look at the range that those tools have been found in based on the sourcing studies, we're looking at potentially millions of households being supplied with mountain pine ridge granite. So the Buffalo Hill Quarry site is large, but it's not that large to account for that amount of demand, right? So how many other sites remain undocumented? Quarry workshop sites remain undocumented. Well, we know that there's others for sure. As when we were conducting excavations, a team led by Javi and Moshe Flores went out and across the creek, and they came back and told us that they had found a mountain of debitage and took some photos, and this is what they recorded. And this is terraces of debitage. This is a panoramic photo looking down at that same area, but this is a steep slope that goes all the way down to the river down below. And this is it's about a 30 to 50 meter long slope, just in thick deposits of debitage. We were walking over this later on in the season, and the debitage wasn't moving underneath our feet. So this is really thick layers of debitage here. Some of these terraces are over 2 meters tall as well, and they continue off into the bush. We don't know the full extent of them, really. And at the top of the hill, there's another 3D model. We get, in this spot alone, close to a dozen bedrock milling features here. And on the edge here, you can see a pile of debitage, right? And the debitage surrounds us. And this is at the very top of the hill. Coming back to the lab, we actually were able to identify this in the LiDAR data. So here's some of the terraces right here going up the hilltop. And there are some cut faces over here as well. But this whole hilltop up here is covered in bedrock milling features. This slope going all the way down to the hill down below is covered in debitage. And it probably continues along this ridge as well. Nearby too, we have yet another area let me go back here real quick. This covers about this, what we have here, this ridge is about a hectare in size. So not as large as Buffalo Hill Quarries, but still another, the amount of debitage here is much greater than we see in the Buffalo Hill Quarries. Elsewhere in the LiDAR data, as I was about to say, we have another area of these donut-shaped holes here. There's one on the other side of this wetlands right here. We're looking at, this is a huge cut face right here, what looks to be a huge cut face. And the piles of debitage, you can't see them so well in this, but the piles of debitage look to be much bigger and much more substantial than what we saw at the Buffalo Hill Quarries. This covers an area of only about 4 hectares. However, this is probably another major working area, similar to this hillside site that we saw just a moment ago. And this is all within the same area of the Buffalo Hills Quarry. So there's a lot going on up here. However, that's all that shows up in our LiDAR, in the LiDAR data that we have, although we haven't had a full survey of the region. Going back to Bulliard's Shrine, a closer reading of the description that he presents suggests that this might be a quarry site, also a quarrying workshop site. He describes the main platform as composed of rather irregular granite slabs laid in rough courses. The exposed edges were trimmed flat, and there was some use of spalls for chinking, but no attempts were made to fit the stone with care. The platform interior is a loose fill of unshaped rocks. And this pretty much describes these debitage piles. Right? Some of them are a bit more, a bit terraced. There's some structure to some of them. Right? We haven't been able to relocate this site yet. It's possible, we need to see, but it's possible there is a structure here. But it sounds like what he's describing is a quarry site, a quarry and workshop site. What's exciting about that is over here is the Buffalo Hills Quarries, in that same area as those other two quarry sites. Bulliard's Shrine is on the other side of the Pine Ridge of the batholith here. So it's possible that we're seeing this whole area. Now that we know what we're looking for, we're probably going to see that this whole area is filled with these quarry sites. That leads to the next question, though, and another problem. Who were the quarry workers? The two largest sites in the area that have been recorded, Pakpatun to the north and Nohochbatso to the southwest, are not that close. They're several kilometers away each from these sites. So who were they? Well, I'll turn to the LiDAR data again to begin to address that question. Oops. We'll come down here to a site, a small house mound that we called Satawit, the Satawit site. This is a small house mound just south of Augustine, the first hill leaving Augustine, which is the forest department's camp. And this is the hill that site is on. If we look at it in side profile, you can make out right here, there's a small mound right here, and immediately adjacent to it is a cave. And that describes the site. Here's the mound right here. And then here's the cave right there. Now, we weren't able to spend much time here. The road crews were going to be quarrying this hill for the road project, and so we only had a few days here, so we couldn't spend too much time investigating. However, what we found was really interesting because we found a couple of early stage metate preforms. So these two pictures on the left this is looking down from the top, and this is pulled up to the side. This is a huge granite block, and you can see the bit of the basin of the metate right here, right? And other granite blocks, another granite block, right? What's interesting about this site is that it's a single occupation. It probably dates the late Classic period, so about 700 to 900. But this is the hill that it's on, and it's by far the tallest and steepest hill around. Yet somebody's lugging big, unrefined blocks of granite to the top of the hill. It's possible that this is a granite workshop, a finishing the people in the site were finishing these products. And what we know is that closer to the Nohochbatso, closer to the Buffalo Hills Quarries, many of the hills in the area, the hilltops in the area, have much more densely settled than we had previously recognized. Each of the circle here represents a plaza of some kind or a house, a structure of some kind. And so one of the things that we need to do was begin to look at these households to see if as what's happening in the ethnographic literature is that people are bringing quarrying raw material, making preforms, then bringing them home and producing them at home where they have more comforts available to them, including things like shade, which is really nice in a hot climate. So were they're making preforms at the quarries and then bringing them to these homes, and who were the people in the area doing this? Another question related to that is, was the production and distribution centralized or decentralized? Were these households just making these and shipping them out, or were they affiliated with some of the local sites? Right? And this brings us back to Nohochbatso and that new plaza. The plaza that's skewed at a different angle than everything else. We had returned there. We had verified it this summer and mapped it. And while we were mapping it, what we found was that there was a lot of granite blocks used in its construction. However, the plaza surface itself had a lot of granite debitage on it and had several granite artifacts on it, like this grooved hammer right here. Right? When we see production waste in the Maya area in plazas, reduction waste, especially with stone tools, that's indicative of a marketplace. And so one of the questions that we're going to ask in the future was Nohochbatzo's Plaza 5 being used as a granite marketplace that's being used to export these materials that were being produced in the Buffalo Hills quarries and the other quarries in the area. So with that, we have a lot of work to do and a lot of work, exciting work ahead of us. And I just want to say thank you for your attention tonight, and thank you to my team. This is by far definitely a team effort, and I have an incredibly dedicated team, and I want to thank them for all the hard work that they've put into this project over the years. And to thank you all for coming out tonight, and to thank my sponsors and Dante and Adam of the Arc Center. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for sharing your latest field season research with us. My name is Dante Faranga, and I'm the Development and Marketing Director at the San Diego Archaeological Center. I'll be moderating the Q&A portion of tonight's discussion, and as usual, you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature located on your Zoom control panel, and we will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. And while I wait for a few questions to come in, I just want to remind everybody that our next lecture on the skeletons of La Constantita with bioarchaeologist Jose Aguilar will take place in person at the center on December 16th. So make sure to check out our website, sandiegoarchaeology.org, for more information on this and our other upcoming events. So actually, John, I had a question. You were talking about with the quarries, you were where the people lived that are using those quarries, but then you were mentioning something about maybe they were taking some of those pieces home and finishing them there. So where do you think that home base was that they were taking them to?
Good question, Dante, and thanks for that. So I think what based on the ethnographic literature, what Brian Hayden recorded in Guatemala was that oftentimes the stone workers will go out to the quarries and collect the blocks and basically do a lot of weight reduction there, but take preforms home to them, and they have workshop and patios at their house. That's just off the back of their house, and so and they'll finish the products there, right? So they're oftentimes under roofs, right? They have shade, they have food available to them, they have their beds available to them, right? It's the creature comforts of home, rather than out in the exposed quarry area. And so what the Sahata Wheats site suggests to us is that perhaps even a site that's really far away, right? This is far away from Nohochbatzo. It's really far from the Buffalo Hills quarries. There's no other quarries anywhere in the LiDAR data anywhere close to this site. Yet somebody is dragging these big, giant, heavy blocks up the hill, up there. And so what I'm wondering is if the people who are living on these hilltop sites, they're farmers, right? They're doing their daily routine. But I'm thinking they might be the quarry workers. So they're maybe going down to the quarries and doing what we see in the ethnographic literature, which is doing a lot of weight reduction there, knocking off the heavy parts of the stone, and then bringing these blocks back and working them at home, at their home workshops.
And so then we have a question about that ethnographic example with somebody using those tools have are currently used. So are living people in the region who use those tools? No.
So this was from Highland, Guatemala. That the ethnographic data was from Highland, Guatemala. There's no stone workers doing this in Belize today. The folks who are doing it in Guatemala now oftentimes will be using metal tools. And so, but they're also working a different material. They were working a different material in the past. They were doing using vesicular basalt. This is granite. And so it's not a perfect parallel, but it's the closest that we have to likely what Maya people in part of the Maya world were doing in the past. So no, nobody's that I know of, that anybody I've talked to knows of anybody who's doing this in Belize today. But this was the ethnographic material from Highland, Guatemala.
And this is a question from your colleague, Joan Schneider. What other types of granite tools are there in settlements and villages besides manos, metates, and grooved hammers?
That's a really good question. There's things like bark beaters, tools like bark beaters. Trying to think off the top of my head what else there'd be. Those are the primary manos metates are the primary granite tools. A unique artifact that was brought to the lab at Pakbatun by somebody. They actually found what now I understand is it's a half loaf, one of the half loaf preforms, but it actually has been carved into a figurine. And so what's interesting is that these half loaves, these are by far the most common item being made at the quarries, yet those aren't actually recorded anywhere else in the Maya area. So I'm not avoiding your question, Joan. I'm just there's manos metates are the primary ones. There's a whole range of granite sort of groundstone objects like bark beaters. I imagine some spindle whorls too may have been made out of granite. So sort of standard range of groundstone objects. There also are a few, there's a couple of sites down that are now inundated, unfortunately, where they made granite stela, or there was a granite stela erected. And we might actually have one at Nohochbatso also, although we're still trying to, we were going to confirm that this summer, and then we decided to piece plot all those objects, and it took us all summer, so we never got back there to see what that was. But architectural blocks as well, construction blocks for building the platforms and structures. So.
And follow-up question from Joan: are the natural weathering patterns of the bedrock tabular in nature?
In some instances, yes, but not all of them. And so it kind of varies with each exposure, really.
And do you think people were coming to the bedrock mortars to use them, or would they be made small enough to be carried off?
These were not carried off. These are embedded in the bedrock itself. So they would have to take the whole mountain with them. So no, we had originally wondered if they were maybe food processing like we see here in California. But the amount of them we found, it's somehow related to, I think it's got to be those half loaves in the mono shaping in some way that they're, because there's so many of them. But no, they're not mobile at all. They're oftentimes in the sides of the hills. They're ground into the bedrock itself.
All right, I think that's all of our questions. So thank you again, John, and thank you to everyone for attending tonight's living room lecture. Hope everyone has a good night.
Thanks, Ante. Thanks, everybody.